It's been a long time since we chatted.
Yeah, it is. Good to talk to you.
You're Nate Wilcox, the creator of Bloody Elbow, for those who don't know,
That's correct.
a historic figure in the MMA journalist landscape, right?
I guess so.
You started when it was rough, like MMA was not mainstream back then, right?
Well, we started in 2007, Valentine's Day 2007. So it was actually already exploded into the mainstream, and it was actually those were the good times. It was really easy. Um, the way Google worked and everything was different, so an independent site had a chance of reaching an audience. There was a lot of interest in MMA. I think the UFC was kind of at a golden age. Pride was still around when we started, but it was sputtering to a stop. So it was a pretty good time to start. As it turned out, it wasn't like the real dark ages when you couldn't even get a UFC pay per view on at all in the states, like around '99 or 2000, when you'd have to stay up all night to see what happened on Pride, on the internet, and you wouldn't get the video for weeks and stuff like that. That was the really difficult time.
How did you come up with the name Bloody Elbow?
Well, it was a foolish mistake. Google continues to punish us for that. But I was talking with Jerome Armstrong, who was one of the founders of SB Nation, and I worked for him in politics, and I was pitching him on the idea of they had a sports network, they had American football sites and baseball sites, and I was pitching him on doing an MMA site, and so he agreed to that, and then I was just showing him some videos, and there was a video, some fight videos, and there was a video of somebody cutting their elbow open, smashing elbows on somebody's face, and I made a joke we should call the site Bloody Elbow, and he went and registered it. So that's how it got the name. And then when I brought on Luke Thomas, he first thing he wanted to do was change the name, but they wouldn't let him. But that was a foolish mistake, I think, in the long run. Google's really hating the name these days.
So
Sorry about.
I noticed Bloody Elbow was I was looking for fight technique breakdowns, and that's how I came up with I found Bloody Elbow. Who came up with that idea? That's a first for MMA websites, right?
Was it? I don't know. I started doing the judo chop originally, and I'm not a trained fighter or anything, but definitely, the furthest thing from it. But there were some techniques that were so interesting and that I saw, and I was just like, "What the heck is that?" And then it was easy to find instructions for this particular move, and so I started doing the judo chop. And the judo chop is a joke. That's an Austin Powers joke.
Yeah, I know.
And so I think that was the first one on Bloody Elbow, and then and later, you came and contributed, and Connor Rubish and different people who actually had some knowledge expanded on the concept, because originally it would just be a GIF of the move, a cut and paste of an explanation of the move and the basic steps of the technique, and now it's become much more elaborate than what it was there.
So
But sorry.
yeah. So sorry to interrupt you. So Bloody Elbow started as a standalone website or part of SB Nation?
It was always part of SB Nation. It was originally on their Scoop platform that they used before they built their own Chorus platform, but it was always owned by Vox. Well, this is before it was Vox Media, but it was always owned by SB Nation. I was just a contractor, and it was never my site or an independent site.
What differentiates Bloody Elbow from other websites? You guys are not just reporting the fight news like most sites, right?
Well,
Uh,
yeah, I mean, we've always tried to have some strong opinion and a perspective on the sport that's more than just the obvious what the UFC wants you to talk about or who's fighting next time. Like, we're still featuring Kareem Zidane for as somebody I'm proud of, and he's done a ton of work to expose some of the less seemly stuff that goes on, especially in places like Eastern Europe, or he's got a new piece on the UFC's plans to expand into Africa and some of the pitfalls they might fall into there. John Nash has broke the story of the class action suit the fighters filed against the UFC. So we've always been willing to cover stuff that the UFC doesn't necessarily want covered, I think is the distinction, that we try to keep as much editorial as independence as possible.
It's easy to get in trouble with topics like that, right?
Yeah, we've never been popular with Dana White. We've been banned by the UFC pretty much our whole tenure. So.
What do you think has changed over the years in MMA?
Well, I mean, so much has changed, but primarily it's just because the UFC has monopolized the sport. I mean, when we started, there would be a UFC on pay-per-view every 6 weeks or so, and there would be a major fight night on Spike maybe once a month. But that left other weeks for regional MMA events in the States to take place, and there was quite a number of them, especially in California, North Texas, Iowa. There were independent. Hawaii had some great promotions. There were independent promoters all around the U.S., and because there wasn't a UFC every weekend, there was fan interest. And then when the UFC started programming events every weekend, it just got harder and harder. They signed up all the fighters and basically just killed the regional MMA scene in the States. So there's not any way for a fighter to build a name. Early on in the UFC or around, the turn of the millennium, there were multiple ways a fighter could make their name, not just in Pride in Japan, but just around the States. And, people like Mayhem Miller or Jake Shields that were not UFC favorites, that were not fighters the UFC wanted to get behind, could still make a name for themselves, so much so that the UFC would kind of have to sign him eventually. And that's just no longer the case. I mean, and especially after, they bought Strikeforce, there just hasn't, Bellator has valiantly kept going, but it's just been really hard for them to get any traction. The UFC, I think, has just kind of flooded the market and done it in a very, in a way that's been good for their short-term business interests, but I think really bad for the sport. I mean, things like the fighter uniforms. MMA used to be such a character-driven sport. Like, who is this? And people had their own looks and their own personas that they had the latitude to create, and that really drove fan interest and intrigue. And the UFC just seems to want it to be red versus blue guys fighting and not really have outsized personalities, other than every once in a while they get their hands on a Conor McGregor or Ronda Rousey that has an interest to fans just intrinsically, and they realize that and jump on that and market it. But for the most part, they don't want to pay fighters. They don't want fighters to have that leverage of being a star. So they really keep a lid on it. You can see with the way they treated the Diaz brothers or GSP or John Jones currently. Obviously a John Jones Francis Ngannou fight would be the biggest heavyweight fight they could book right now. But they don't want to do it because John Jones wants more money than they want to give him, and the facts are pretty clear that the business model is such that they keeping fighter pay low is one of the few costs they can control, and that really is where their enormously fat profit margins come from. And you look at boxing, even these Jake Paul, spectacles that are being put on. I mean, fighters can make so much more money off that just because it's a more equitable split. So, I think at one time the UFC had a real opportunity to compete for the best athletes. Maybe not the very best athletes. I don't think they would have ever been competitive with the NBA or the NFL. But at lower weight classes, I think they could have been competing with, Olympic wrestling and judo and boxing for some of the very best athletes in the world. And they chose to take a different path where they keep fighter pay low, and you're just not going to get the very top athletes that way. Wrestling, there was a period when the UFC was a real career pipeline for Olympic caliber wrestlers, and you don't see that anymore. And part of that's because Olympic wrestling, USA wrestling, has made a concerted effort to offer more career options and do a better job of providing career paths and financing for their athletes. But the UFC's unwillingness to pay and the way the UFC has controlled the marketplace has really put a lid on that as well.
There is a counter argument to that, that boxers, like low tier boxers, don't really make any money, right? Whereas
Well,
there is
definitely.
some kind of pay in the lower tier of the fighters in the UFC, right?
You can definitely. There are boxers that don't make a lot of money, but once you get to the mid tier of boxing, they're making multiples of the money that a UFC champion can make. So, there's not a very strong argument that the UFC is a better career path than boxing as far as fighter pay. I mean, obviously anybody at the bottom of a field is going to make very little money, and there are boxing events where people on the bottom of the card make money that's bad or comparable to what UFC fighters on the bottom of the card make, but that's just because zero is a pretty low number, and you work up from there.
One thing, at least, that the UFC was able to do was establish women's MMA, and now they're headliners with women's MMA. That I don't see it happening in boxing anytime soon, right?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, you're seeing Clarissa Shields entering MMA now because women's boxing just, unless you're Muhammad Ali's daughter, women's boxing has just never really corralled that much fan interest. And because of Gina Carano and Ronda Rousey in MMA, women's MMA has proven to be of interest to fans. And I don't know exactly why that is. I think, I don't know. I mean, maybe it's the aesthetics of women's boxing
I
isn't as interesting.
personally, I think it's the brand. American audiences have brand awareness. So once it's Nike, once it's they will purchase the product. So once it was branded as a UFC title event, it's still a UFC title event. Of course,
Yeah.
this didn't apply to Demetrius Johnson, of course. You know.
No, no, and we've seen a number of female UFC fighters or champs that have not been strong draws, but we've seen several that have been, including Ronda Rousey, who's one of the biggest draws in the sport. So there just hasn't ever been a female boxer with that kind of marquee value that Ronda Rousey or Gina Carano had. So people aren't used to it, but you still get fan frustration with some of these female UFC fights that some of these fighters that tend to be point fighters. It can be pretty tedious 5 rounds, watching strawweight fighters point fight or punch the air. So I definitely don't think the UFC could go to like an all women's lineup. I think male MMA is still much more popular than female MMA. But if the right female fighter comes along, there's an opportunity. And some of these female fighters are great. I was initially uncomfortable with seeing women get punched in the face, but that's long been forgotten. And Amanda Nunes and others have been really great fighters. So yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon. And I think just in boxing, there's been no controlling power in boxing to push female boxing, and it's been hard to compete with Floyd Mayweather or Manny Pacquiao or Canelo Alvarez or the other stars of the medium. But now that you've got the Paul brothers making such an enormous splash on the business side with utterly garbage fights, I mean, this is at best comparable to like celebrity boxing in the 90s, and yet it's outselling. It's selling so much on pay-per-view, and by far the Paul brothers have been the dominant business story in combat sports this year. So there's definitely opportunities, and the Paul brothers have seized that to shake up the business side of it, and it's not just UFC that's kind of been in the doldrums, but pro wrestling in America has been in the doldrums as well, which obviously is sports entertainment, but there's huge audience overlap. And as you've seen the initial appeal of the UFC was total freak show. Like, let's put a refrigerator repairman from Iowa in the cage with, somebody who says he's a sumo wrestler and see what happens. Yeah,
or
a ninja.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. MMA in Japan especially evolved directly out of pro wrestling, where people who were fascinated with what would happen if we applied these techniques in a real fight made it happen, over the course of a couple decades. And it was just sort of a coincidence that MMA had stayed alive in Brazil, where it came out of a catch wrestling circumstances. I mean, the original Gracie fights, in 1917 were very much in the venues and promoted the same way as catch wrestling bouts. And the early judokas who traveled barnstorm through the States and into Cuba and Europe and South America, they were essentially challenging people in the same way that catch wrestlers were, and taking on catch wrestlers. So, MMA evolved directly out of professional wrestling, and it's always relevant what's going on. But in both professional wrestling and UFC and MMA in the States, you have monopolies. I mean, WWE doesn't quite have a monopoly, but they don't have a serious competitor. AEW is trying, but the McMahon family has controlled pro wrestling for decades, and they're just shrinking the pie. They're taking a bigger share of it for themselves, but there's less interest in it, and it creates an opportunity for people like the Pauls to mix things up and draw fan interest.
People make the argument that Conor McGregor was self-promoted himself, but that's not actually true, right? The UFC spent a lot of money to promote him.
Well, yeah, it was an alliance. They quickly
Yeah,
figured out that he had
I mean
unusual
it's a two-way
charisma.
street. Both of them were doing this, but they're arguing that fighters have to promote themselves, while the UFC doesn't really promote them, and it's not easy for a fighter to promote themselves. They don't have the venue
Yeah,
most
it's
of the
it's
times.
it's
Yeah,
very difficult. And the UFC, I mean, and promoting Conor McGregor, it was very easy to promote Conor McGregor. The UFC has never really excelled at making stars. There have only been a handful of either athletes like GSP or John Jones who were so skilled that, or Anderson Silva, that they had a long title run, that they beat multiple worthy challengers, that they had multiple really interesting, really great fights, as athletic feats. And, the UFC was able to promote guys like that fairly well. But the so many of their stars became stars in other platforms, Strikeforce or Pride or regional promotions, and they never really developed a real way of building fighters as stars, except when they were gifted with these people like Ronda Rousey and Conor McGregor, who had an outsized charisma, and there was something about their story that appealed to a lot of people. Like with Conor McGregor, I don't think you can underestimate how big a factor it was that he was an Irish star, and Ireland hadn't had, has this long tradition of boxing stars, but had never had an MMA star before. So you've got a new sport and a country with a strong fighting tradition, and it just really clicked, and a lot of Irish Americans, there's been a big Irish diaspora, and so there were a lot of things that made Conor McGregor an attractive package, and the UFC got behind him early on and pushed him really hard. But you can see at other times, like with Sage and Paige, that didn't work for them at all. They really tried to push Paige Van Zant, and I can't remember Sage Northcutt. They really tried to push these kids because they're pretty, they're blonde, they're quote unquote all American, and they just couldn't fight.
yeah,
They
they
were
were not
not good.
exactly killers, right?
Yeah, and they this sport is too competitive and too brutal to try to protect a fighter and build a fighter that way. Um, so they've struggled with that, and then there's so many other fighters uh, that they're the story is, well, promote yourself, but basically they don't want to pay the fighters, and they don't want to invest and build stars, because look how much trouble they had with Conor McGregor. I mean, one of his biggest fights was with Floyd Mayweather, and they took a big piece of that, but they would have made much more money had he stayed in MMA the whole time. That the boxing sideline. I mean, Conor McGregor could have been this astounding record-setting MMA champion. He was winning in multiple divisions, and it's still unclear to this day whether he really had the skill set to be a long-term champion the way GSP or John Jones did. But as it was, he was just kind of this comet that passed over the sport and then immediately gravitated to boxing, where he could make much more money. And all the weight class changes and the sport changes and the time off and the various dramas and court cases, you know, prevented him from having the kind of career that really builds a sport. You know, he could have been the Muhammad Ali or the Babe Ruth of MMA, and instead he's this kind of wanderer who jumped around in sports and jumped around in weight classes and you know, lost the fight to Nate Diaz when that didn't. It created a great short-term feud, and they were able to have a rematch, and he came back and beat him. But I definitely don't feel like Conor McGregor achieved his potential as a mixed martial artist. Although he accomplished amazing things, you know, winning the multiple belts and everything. But it's, to me, telling when a sport can't deliver on the promise of a champion like that to build a resume of fights and a legacy that builds the sport. You know, boxing had Sugar Ray Robinson and Joe Louis and Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier and all these, you know, marvelous Marvin Hagler and Sugar Ray Leonard and all these great champions that had such great fights and storied careers, and it inspired other athletes to want to be that, to grow up to be that. And MMA, we had a movie about Muhammad Ali. We've had multiple movies, documentaries, fictional films. I don't think you're going to see that about Conor McGregor, or not in a way where where he's a straight up hero. It might be an anti-hero or a story of failed potential, but it's never going to be, you know, Seabiscuit the racehorse or whatever that people are talking about 40 years after the animal died. I mean, you know, I don't think Conor McGregor is going to be a lasting cultural myth in the way that I think he had the potential to be. And Ronda Rousey in the same way. I mean, she had this really impressive title run, but then as soon as she ran into some difficulty, she folded. And I don't think that was the UFC's fault. That was a personal thing on her, where she just could not handle defeat at all. And
Let's start again.
um,
What's your take on the state of modern MMA? Where's the trend going?
it's hard for me to be. I don't want to be just Mr. Negative, but as a fan, nothing's really captured my imagination since the emergence of Israel Adesanya, and his attempt to move up to light heavyweight. I think was hubristic, you know, and turned out poorly, and is a function of the UFC's inability to promote fighters within their divisions in their promotion in a way that is a satisfying career arc and financially beneficial. It's making, you know, everybody saw what Conor McGregor did, and you know, now you've got John Jones wanting to jump up to heavyweight, and with Adesanya, I think it's more a function of the middleweight division. Just not that there's not great competition in that division, but there's not any marquee names in that division. There's no way to get bigger than he is now, staying in the middleweight division. And even if he were to put together an Anderson Silva type run, which I think even for somebody as gifted as he is, would be quite difficult, there's really no way to parlay that into even the level of fame that Anderson Silva achieved. And so I just feel like we're in an era of diminishing returns, where the UFC's incentives are to sell a product to ESPN that is streamed. And if you look at what's happening to investment categories all over the world, there's all this money that's being handed out to the extremely wealthy to quote unquote invest. And instead of investing it in jobs and things that will produce jobs, they're buying up assets. And the streaming bubble is, I presume it's going to be a bubble. I mean, it's these legacy media companies like Disney, which owns ESPN, just gobbling up space. And there's this war to beat Netflix and beat Amazon and to deliver your entertainment product via streaming. And so they're trying to move ESPN out of the cable television era into the internet streaming era, and the UFC is a bedrock of that because the UFC has this loyal audience, but there's no incentives for Dana White and Endeavor, the owners of the UFC, to deliver the best product for the fans because they get paid a flat fee no matter what
Regardless. Yeah,
happens.
regardless.
And
Yeah.
yeah, and ESPN doesn't necessarily have the leverage or the insight. I mean, they're very happy just to have this steady, loyal audience that the UFC has built up over the decades, buying their streaming products and their pay-per-view. So it's a win for ESPN and it's a win for Endeavor, but I think it's a big loss long term for the UFC and for the fans. It just and the same thing's happening with the WWE and the Peacock network. I mean, they're just incentivized to just slowly take value out of these brands, and there's no incentive to compete for having the big weekend. I mean, the fact that all of the promoters in combat sports are getting pantsed by the Paul brothers right now is just appalling. I mean, you had celebrity boxing in the 90s, and you had tough man contests, and you had the UFC come out of nowhere, but it didn't overshadow what was going on with HBO boxing or with WWE and the WCW and the Monday Night Wars in the 90s. And the UFC emerged as this whole new sport. You had Pride in Japan make it an international phenomenon. And so celebrity boxing was just a blip. I mean, it was something that got a little bit of attention on American network television for a little while, but what the Paul brothers is doing is actually distorting the center of gravity for all of combat sports. And it's garbage. Even the kids watching it, from the teens I've talked to who watched it, they got that this was not a value, the product that was worth what they paid for it. I
It was
mean,
not legit competition, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
that watching an exhibition match between a retired boxer who's one of the greats of all time, but who has no incentive to really try hard and to carry the guy, and a guy who's a semi-pro boxer at best. Uh, I mean, that's a fine thing for them to do, but the fact that it's one of the biggest combat sports events of the quarter, and then the Jake Paul Ben Askren fight was even bigger, and the next Jake Paul Tyrone Woodley fight should be bigger than that. It's really disconcerting and disappointing, and it has nothing to do with sport. This isn't quality boxing. These are people. The Paul brothers are celebrities because of their YouTube antics. Again, that's fine, but it doesn't add up to anything. It's not sport. You're not seeing the best. You're not seeing the sport evolve. You're not seeing. I mean, the things we love about sport are seeing the best athletes possible performing at the peak of their ability against other great athletes, so that you get this mix of strategy and technique. And in MMA, for a long time, what was so exciting to watch was the evolution of the sport. I mean, at first, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Japanese shoot wrestling were the dominant forms, and you could see, watching those styles collide, and then all these different random people they were competing with, you could see, what these techniques work, these techniques don't work, and things evolved. And then, amateur wrestlers come in, and everybody has to up their takedown game, and then kickboxers figured out how to play the guard and get up from a takedown. And you see Maurice Smith, winning the UFC titles and knocking out Mark Coleman. It was just very exciting. And Kazushi Sakuraba beating the Gracie family, and so many martial artists. And then by the 2000s, you had people like Anderson Silva and Lyoto Machida, who incorporated all these taekwondo and karate techniques that people had written off. And just super. I mean, virtually every major martial arts style except kung fu has gotten to shine, and shown that these techniques might not work, or you might have to learn how to defend takedowns. But wow, if you can pull off a wheel kick, that's a real technique, and it can be really exciting and effective. It's there's a few fighters that I'm seeing that are promising, that are exciting, and a few fighters that I'm excited by and try to tune in for. But week after week, especially, as a job where I have to watch MMA whether I want to or not, week after week after week of just mediocre fights. I mean, the UFC roster, and now that they're starting to cut people that are in the top 10 of their divisions, you know, they just don't care anymore. It creates an opportunity for Bellator, I guess. But it you're just seeing the UFC just sort of churning out, red corner versus blue corner guys fighting, and it doesn't mean anything. And it doesn't, once upon a time, if you got into the UFC, it meant you had achieved a certain level, and we could see you fighting competitors we knew and had a context to compare them to. But now you get somebody who could be 3, 4, 5, 6 fights into UFC career, and having never really fought somebody who's a true UFC veteran. Everybody they fought is another piece of chum that's been thrown in the UFC, with no significant record against marquee competition, and it's just meaningless. I think they would be better off if they just signed, 20 people per division, locked them in for a year or 2-year contract, and said, this is the pool. This is who's fighting in the UFC. Let these people fight in as many different combinations as we can pull off in this 2-year period. And then we'd see who's the best in that pool. And people would know the fighters and would care. Like if you don't know who these people are, it just has no context or meaning, and it's just pointless. So,
the fighters themselves have to work a little bit on their marketing. Like, I love
well, sure.
Stipe Miocic, right?
Yeah.
You ask him who he wants to fight next, and he says whoever the UFC wants me to fight. Like, come on, pick a fight.
Yeah. and
keep things going.
and that's a problem. But everybody can't be expected to be Conor McGregor, and it's got to do with the context. I mean, if you remember Pancrase, they had this limited pool of fighters, and even if some of those fighters were pretty mediocre, you had seen them fight Ken Shamrock, and you'd seen him fight Bas Rutten, and you'd seen him fight Suzuki and Funaki, and so you had some concern when they got in the ring, and those guys didn't do anything to promote themselves. That was Pancrase doing it with the colored boots and the ring. Pancrase marketed Pancrase, and the fighters could sometimes supplement that marketing, and somebody like Bas Rutten or Ken Shamrock or Frank Shamrock certainly marketed themselves well. But the UFC is almost making it impossible to try to market themselves, or pushing fighters like Israel Adesanya, who's a brilliant marketer and a great interview and really bright, really interesting person with a great backstory. And you're seeing him make an ill-advised move to light heavyweight kind of out of desperation and
with the wrong opponent. Like, I would love to see him against John Jones.
Yeah. Just not a marquee fight at all, and also a bad matchup for him. And so it was. I just feel like nobody's at home at the UFC, or nobody's at home that cares about the fighters, or cares about anything other than just extracting wealth from this, and it's microcosm of the overall economic picture that we're seeing globally, and it's just a brutal time, and not a time that's going to produce great things, I don't think.
On another note, what the Paul brothers did in boxing, they couldn't do in MMA, right? Like,
no.
You cannot be semi-amateur and face UFC level competition and make it. There are too many ways to lose.
Yeah. Definitely not. I mean, you would be humiliated. You would be taken down and held down and humiliated and probably finished. And I mean, it seemed pretty clear to me watching the Mayweather-Paul fight on Fast Forward that despite his size disadvantage, if Mayweather had just kept working the body, he would have finished him. It seemed pretty clear.
I think that's why they chose 8 rounds instead of 10. They watched the Conor McGregor fight and said, we're not playing that game with him. The guy doesn't get tired.
And I don't think Mayweather cared about the outcome. He just cared about the paycheck, And
what do you think of the controversy when they're saying that he held him up and whatever? It didn't look like that to me. Like, I don't know.
No, I mean, I don't think it's worth that level of concern to try to parse that out. I do think that Mayweather coasted a bit and could have taken him out even in the 8 rounds if he'd wanted to. And I think he was carrying McGregor too. I think he could have turned it on against McGregor quickly. But yeah, boxing is a sport that um, it's got a narrowly defined range of attacks that you can use, and so it makes it somewhat easier for somebody to have this match between a semi-pro and an elite level pro or formerly elite level pro. Um, carry. And yeah, it'd be very hard to see. I mean, Jake Paul's talking noise about how he wants to do an MMA fight, but I don't expect you to see him do that until he's played out the string on this boxing stuff. I mean, because I think he's got an excellent chance against Tyron Woodley. Woodley's got power, but he's quite a bit smaller than Jake Paul.
I think he has an excellent chance against Tyron Woodley.
Yeah,
Tyron Woodley lately has not been boxing very well in his MMA fights.
No, and his boxing was a function of his wrestling as well. If he can't set up a takedown,
he has power. He has power, but power is not, I don't know.
Yeah, he has one, big right hand punch basically, and if Jake Paul works hard and concentrates, he should be able to avoid that. And then Woodley's psychology, he's been afraid to pull the trigger or something.
Yeah.
He's been kind of frozen, and so I really have to hand it to Jake Paul and his handlers. It's a perfect pick. It's a step up from Ben Askren. It's got a lot of people that I respect, like Anton Tabuena at Bloody Elbow, who think, oh, Woodley's just going to kill this guy, and we're finally going to get to see that, revenge on Jake Paul that we all want to see.
Whoever picked Ben Askren to beat anybody in a boxing match, like, I was going crazy. Like, really?
Yeah.
The guy has no knockouts in his,
No, and I mean, I was a fan of Ben Askren as a wrestler and as an MMA fighter, and he could strike in MMA, but in the context of his swarming takedown.
Yeah, to close
attack.
the distance and
but
his game. Yeah.
But in a pure boxing match, he had no chance and didn't even try. He didn't even come in shape. He just walked in and I don't think he dived. I don't think he needed to. Jake Paul's a pretty big guy who caught him with a good punch, and he fell down and didn't get back up again. I don't know that he tried his hardest, but it was brilliant picking on their part, and they're doing a good job of moving up the food chain a little bit, but still against a guy who's much smaller than him, who's not a boxer. Any professional caliber boxer in his weight class, you feel like, would just piece up Jake Paul, so it's just maddening, and that's kind of just the appeal of it. And if that's what kids are into these days.
One last question, because we have to go.
Yeah.
Francis Ngannou versus John Jones, if it ever happens, who do you have?
That's a really hard pick. I'd be rooting for John Jones, but I'm afraid the extra weight would slow him down, and his height has always been a big part of his arsenal at light heavyweight, and he won't have that reach and size advantage against Ngannou. But I think he's far more well-rounded and skilled than Ngannou. But Ngannou's power is fearsome. So
if it goes past the first round, though, who's gasping for air?
Well, definitely, I think Jones. Again, I don't know though. At heavyweight, I don't know. Jones might be too muscled up at heavyweight. So I'd say 60% chance Ngannou wins. But
for me, it's the opposite. 60% Jones.
Jones.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully we get to see it. But again, why is the UFC not making this fight happen? Because they don't want to pay big money.
Yeah.
They don't want to break their pay model.
Yeah.
Their whole model is built on giving no more than 15 to 20% of the money to the athletes. And compare that with boxing or the NBA, 50% should go to the athlete. That's the norm. And again, the reason they can do that is because they're not the ones making the profit on the pay-per-view. ESPN's the one making on the profit on the pay-per-view. And unless Disney gets interested enough to drill down and say what's actually going on here and what fights do we need to really make this blow up, but they don't care because they're getting subscriptions for EM Plus. They're getting pay-per-view buys that they wouldn't be getting otherwise. So a mediocre UFC product is a huge win for Disney and ESPN, and a big win for Endeavor, and a big win for Dana White, and a big loss for the fighters, and a big loss for the fans. And that's where we're at.
So Nate, I would like to thank you for your time. and for giving me a chance to work for Bloody Elbow. I think I did like 90 posts. It's the most diverse MMA website in the world. Like, who would give a guy with a, from Greece a chance to write for one of the top websites in the world? I had a great time.
We're proud to feature your work, and
Thank
still
you
are. So
again,
thanks,
and,
Gus. It's my pleasure.
Hopefully we'll get to talk again because we could talk for hours.
Yeah.
Okay.
Happy to do it, man.
So
Take care.
thank you and take care. Bye.